Prime Minister Narendra Modi today hit out at critics raising questions on India's growth story. The Prime Minister, however, admitted that India's growth did slip to 5.7%, but reminded everyone that it was not the first time that this has happened. He then reassured the countrymen that the government is committed to reviving India's growth story.
साथियों, ये बात सही है कि पिछले 3 वर्षों में 7.5% की औसत ग्रोथ हासिल करने के बाद इस वर्ष अप्रैल जून की तिमाही में जीडीपी ग्रोथ में कमी दर्ज की गई है। हम इसका इनकार नहीं करते, लेकिन ये बात भी उतनी ही सही है कि सरकार इस ट्रेंड को रिवर्स करने के लिए पूरी तरह से प्रतिबद्ध है, क्षमतावान है, हम फैसले लेने के लिए तैयार हैं।
Right, the Prime Minister Narendra Modi there admitting, while also hitting out at the critics who've raised questions on where exactly India's growth story is going. He did, however, make an admission that India's growth did slip to 5.7%, but simultaneously reminded everyone that it wasn't the first time that this has happened. He, of course, reassured the citizens of India that his government was committed to reviving India's growth. He said that the slip occurred in the quarter between April and June. This was an admission that Prime Minister Modi made. Santosh Mehrotra, senior economist, joining us on the broadcast to talk more about Prime Minister Modi's comments. Mr. Mehrotra, if I could just ask you to comment first of all on the admission by Prime Minister Modi that indeed there has been a slip, but that his government is committed to reviving India's growth story. Mr. Mehrotra, if you can hear me, that question was for you, sir. I was asking if you could comment on the Prime Minister's statement today, that admission that there has been a slip in growth, but that the commitment to reviving India's growth story stands.
Well, we have to appreciate that governments don't control GDP. The GDP happens. It's the outcome of myriads of processes, mostly in the private sector, which lead to a GDP figure. And honestly, as far as the quarterly growth rates are concerned, I think we should take them with a slight pinch of salt, because we know that these are projections. In our country, we don't get data that frequently, and therefore, if you ask the Central Statistical Office, they will tell you that projections are what is the quarterly figures are based on. So anyway, the bottom line is any government is committed to increasing growth. But what we need to understand is why has growth slowed in the last several years. Yes, go ahead.
Fair enough, sir. I was going to ask you also, of course, I think there was a mention of GST. The Prime Minister said that the panel is reviewing the pains caused by the GST to a number of people. Yes. Do you think that this level of honesty was also in some ways perhaps a different approach, one that we haven't seen from many heads of state before?
No, honesty in any Prime Minister is a very good thing. Of course, that goes without saying. But, you know, I think what we need to recognize is that the fundamentals are not very promising and not very strong, as a result of which the growth rate has slowed significantly in the last several years. We have to understand that the investment rate has gone down significantly. Credit is down, which is the reason why industrial production is down. Capacity utilization in industry has been stagnant at 70%. Why would any industrialist invest in a situation where he has spare underutilized capacity? So you see, we have to understand why growth has sustained. The growth has sustained primarily on account of 2 or 3 factors, which, if you give me a minute, I will try and explain.
Go ahead, sir.
Some 2.5 years ago, oil prices began to fall. They were $150 per barrel about 4 or 5 years ago, and since then they have fallen to about $50 per barrel. When oil prices fall, and India imports about 80% of its oil needs, and oil is input into many products, which go into industry. So point is that if exports are not growing, and if imports fall dramatically, then the difference between exports and imports increases, which shows up in high GDP. This is one reason why GDP has been increasing. A second reason why GDP appears to be increasing is because oil is an input into many other products, which are intermediates and raw materials into other production. And when oil prices fall so dramatically, all input costs fall for industry and for agriculture. And the difference, but prices don't fall necessarily. Prices don't fall. So in other words, the difference between revenue and cost increases, showing up in profit, which is what shows up in GDP. It doesn't mean that, capacity utilization is high. It doesn't mean that more output is being created. It doesn't mean that new jobs are being created. It's just that the difference between input costs and prices at which goods are being sold has risen, so it shows up in higher GDP. And similarly for the government, when oil prices fell dramatically, its subsidies fell. And that the fall in subsidies shows up in the government account. And that shows up in GDP. These are the reasons. So, windfall gains should not be seen as something very positive. And oil price drop was a windfall gain. So you understand from what I've just been saying that, GDP is not fully
it's not the only factor that we absolutely, and it has to be looked in a larger perspective. Mr. Narendra, thanks very much for joining in and sharing your perspective with us on this story.